Hello, my name's Louise Ulrich and a warm welcome to this session on cloud portability, or as I've subtitled it, Paths to the Cloud. Now what do I mean by this? Well, today many customers have traditional volume licensing licenses which they've used to license on-premises workloads, but they're increasingly thinking of moving some or all of their on-premises solutions to the cloud. And what I want to show you in this session is how they can take their existing licenses and start to use them to license a variety of cloud solutions. Now there are 6 main scenarios I want to look at. Let's have a look at what they are. We're going to start off by looking at license mobility through software assurance and to see what cloud scenarios this opens up for customers in terms of the application servers such as SharePoint Server and SQL Server. You may already be familiar with license mobility, which is great, but I want to take this opportunity to show you how some additional software assurance benefits extend the advantage of license mobility. And in particular, I'll be talking about failover rights and self-hosted use rights and the scenarios that they enable. Then we'll turn to a new software assurance benefit, the Azure Hybrid Use benefit, and see how this gives customers flexibility with their existing Windows Server licenses. Next up will be shared computer activation, and this is all to do with running applications such as Office 365 Pro Plus in such a way that they can be used by licensed users on shared hardware. Then we'll look at some of the solutions that require users to be licensed for remote desktop services, or RDS, and see how extended use rights can offer flexibility with cloud deployment of those solutions. Next, we'll see how customers who are already licensed for on-premises products can acquire subscriber access licenses, or SALs for SA, to give them the flexibility of moving to a hybrid or cloud solution for their productivity servers. And finally, we'll take a look at the developer community and see what cloud options there are for developers already licensed with a Visual Studio Standard subscription. Now, do note that you may know these subscriptions by their previous name of MSDN subscriptions. But let's get started. Our first topic is license mobility through software assurance. Now, how does this help organisations get to the cloud? Well, of course, it's all about using existing volume licensing licenses with software assurance to license applications in a cloud infrastructure. This means that it's very easy to move application server workloads to the cloud. There's nothing new to purchase from an application server's licensing perspective. Let's take a look in detail. Now here you can see a server which is owned by a partner, and that's indicated by the asset tag at the top of the server. And you can see that virtual machines are running on that server for different customers, and I've indicated that by the different coloured asset tags. Now I'll be referring to these customers as end customers throughout this session. So how's this licensed? Well, let's start with the infrastructure, and this machine is licensed by the partner through the Services Provider License Agreement, or SPLA. They would use this agreement to license the physical server and the infrastructure of the virtual machines. And I'm going to be using these blue licenses to indicate that they've been acquired through a partner's SPLA agreement. The partner has become a service provider by signing the SPLA, and to be able to offer services in this particular scenario, they're also an authorised mobility partner, and they've achieved this by signing an addendum to their SPLA. Now the end customers want applications running in the virtual machines here, so how are they licensed? Well, this is of course where the end customer can use their existing licenses to license these workloads as long as they have software assurance. Here are the licenses assigned for this company and a different colour for the other company, and I'll always show licenses that are acquired through volume licensing agreements in this way. So what do we have here? Well, the profile of the end customer is that they want a partner to manage the hardware and the infrastructure, but they have existing application server licenses with software assurance, and they want to continue to use and manage these licenses, and that's exactly what the license mobility through SA benefit allows them to do. For no extra licensing cost, they can now choose to move the relevant workloads to the cloud using the same licenses they had previously used for on-premises deployments. But actually, it's not just an environment hosted by a service provider that an end customer can use in this way. They can also use Microsoft Azure. Let's take a look. So in fact, license mobility through software assurance rights allow an end customer with SA on his application server licenses to assign those licenses either to a service provider shared hardware, which is what we looked at on the previous slide, or in fact to a virtual machine running on Azure, which is what this slide covers. You can see that I've represented the Microsoft Data Center with Azure services by the server with virtual machines on the left of the screen here, where the little clouds represent the infrastructure being provided through Azure rather than through SPLA, as with the service provider's data center. And the end customers are using their application server licenses as we saw before. Now, from an end customer perspective, it's important to make sure that the licenses that they want to assign to the cloud actually have the relevant rights. So let's look at how they would check that. There's a document called the Product Terms document, and this details the specific rights about the license mobility through SA benefit, and you can see a snippet from the document at the top here. This shows the permitted use and the requirements. For instance, in the permitted use, you're reminded that you still need CALs or subscription licenses, SLs, to access the server products if you choose to deploy them using license mobility through SA rights. Now, these are the general terms, but you do also need to check that a particular product has the license mobility through SA rights. And here at the bottom, I've taken a snippet from the SQL Server section of the product terms. And you can see that license mobility is listed under the software assurance section at the left. And it tells us that license mobility is indeed available for all editions of SQL Server, except for the Parallel Data Warehouse edition, which does make sense, since that of course is a special edition of SQL Server, which only runs on pre-configured appliances. Now, it's also worth knowing some of the products that don't have license mobility through SA rights, and most notable are Office and Windows Server. However, as we go through this session, you'll see that there are different benefits which do give us deployment flexibility with these products, so stand by. Now look back at the top part where the general rights are listed, and can you see that under requirements you must deploy products either on Azure or with a qualified license mobility through SA partner. Now, I've been talking about a service provider as hosting the infrastructure, and indeed a license mobility through SA partner will have signed the SPLA, but they will have also signed an addendum to make them eligible to offer the service. And finally, the end customer needs to complete and submit a license mobility verification form where they choose the hosted environment they want to use, either Azure or a specific partner, and where they specify how many licenses they want to use in the cloud. You can see here that I've used the June 2016 product terms document, and this document is updated monthly, so the page references and the exact text that you see here may change. My recommendation to you would always be to use the latest version of the document and to check the terms within that version to make sure that you're completely up to date on the language. This is a useful slide to give a summary of the whole license verification process and the parts that the different organisations play in a successful deployment of workloads via the license mobility through SA rights. Now, looking down the service provider column, you can see a reminder of how a service provider becomes a license mobility through SA partner. They sign the license mobility addendum that I've mentioned, and they will help the end customer with the rest of the process. Looking at the first column for the end customer's responsibilities, you can see that they need to make sure that the licenses they want to use are eligible, they need to engage with an authorised partner, and then they need to complete and submit that license verification form to Microsoft. And switching to the last column, the Microsoft column, you can see that Microsoft confirm all parts of the process, certifying partners as these authorised mobility partners, as well as confirming that the end customer has the right licenses and may use them in this scenario. Microsoft sends the verified form back to both the end customer and the service provider, and you can see that the service provider needs to keep these forms on file. At the end of each of our sections in this session, we'll also take a look at where you can find out more information if you want to. This is the website that's useful for both end customers and partners to find out more about the license mobility through SA benefit. And in the customer section of this site, you'll also find a useful guide for end customers, which actually is very informative for partners as well. So that's well worth a look. Now imagine that you're an end customer and you've used your existing volume licensing licenses to license a SQL Server workload in the cloud. Here I'm showing it within a service provider's data center, but actually everything we'll talk about on this slide is true for Azure too, since Microsoft is also a licensed mobility provider through Azure. So as an end customer, you've followed the required process and the licenses are correctly assigned to the deployment in the virtual machine. And one of the features you want to make use of within SQL Server is to deploy a failover server, and you determine that a passive failover server will suit your solution. Now, a passive failover server is another instance of SQL Server which is kept entirely synchronized with the main database, the active server, but it's not serving any information out to any users. However, should the active server fail, then the passive server can take over the tasks of the active server and itself become the active server. Now let's represent the passive server here. Now in reality, this is probably a different virtual machine in the service provider's data center, but let's not make our diagram too messy. The main thing I want to talk about here is how this passive server is licensed, since it's another installation of SQL Server that's synchronizing with the active server. Well, the good news is that there are no licenses required for this passive server, since it's covered by the software assurance on the original license. But let's be clear. The passive failover instance has to be running in the same infrastructure as the active server. So here I've got them both running in a service provider's data center. What I would not be allowed to do is to have the active server running on my own servers as an end customer and then have the failover server running in my service provider's data center. So here we've seen how an end customer can take a workload to the cloud and license it within an existing license with SA and then make use of further SA benefits such as failover rights. Again, let me show you where you would check out the rights for this sort of deployment, and you can see we need to refer to the product terms document again. At the top we've got some general information about failover rights, and you can see the failover server needs to be a passive server. Then we need to check that the particular product that we're interested in has these failover rights, and you can see that I've again taken the section for SQL Server, and at the top right you can see that it does indeed have failover rights. And finally, there's a section which states that failover rights are also granted on shared servers, so that's servers in a service provider's data center or in Azure. Let's now look at a scenario that builds on what customers can do with their volume licensing licenses when they have software assurance. This section is focused on taking those licenses and using them to license applications running in a service provider's data center. Now have a look at the diagram on this slide. We can see the service provider's infrastructure, which is licensed through SPLA, and then we can see that the yellow and the green organisations have licensed applications running on that shared hardware with their volume licensing licenses with software assurance. But the applications look different, so what's going on here? Well, this shows that the organisations have developed a solution around the Microsoft software. Let's take SQL Server in this case, and they now want their own end customers to have access to this solution, for which of course they will charge a fee. And are they allowed to do this? Well, there are some requirements which we'll go through, but if those are met, then this is absolutely allowable. So let's take a look at the requirements. The yellow and green organisations are probably development organisations whose business is building solutions. Perhaps they're ISVs, and in this scenario they need to have built a solution around SQL Server that adds significant and primary functionality to SQL Server. It's not just hosting SQL Server, it's a proper solution built on SQL Server. Can you see that I've made the application boxes look different to illustrate that the yellow organisation has built functionality in one area and the green organisation in another? So that's the first requirement. The organisations have added functionality over and above the Microsoft products and they own that intellectual property. The second requirement is that they're using products that include self-hosting rights. Now we'll see on the next slide that it's the product terms that documents whether products have these rights when software assurance is acquired with a license. So far so good. But one thought you may have is, can the green and yellow organisations use their own servers to host these applications for their end customers? Well, the short answer is they could, and they would need to acquire Windows Server external connector licenses for that solution. The main point I want to make here is that they have choice. They can self-host in their own data centres, or they can take exactly the same licenses and use them in a service provider's infrastructure. Let's just finish on this slide by looking at this example from the service provider's perspective, assuming that they're a different organisation from the yellow and green organisations. Do these self-hosting rights we've been talking about offer them an alternative solution for offering software services to their end customers? Well, the answer is probably not. If they don't add significant functionality to the products, then they can't use them in this way, and SPLA would continue to be absolutely the right vehicle for them to use to offer software services. Now, you should note at this point that the yellow and green organisations also need to follow the licence mobility verification process that we've already talked about in this section, since they are of course assigning the licences to a service provider's data centre. Here's the relevant information from the product terms document, the general information at the top, and then SQL Server taken as an example to show at the bottom left that all editions have self-hosting rights. Note the last paragraph in the first section, which clearly states that you can't use Windows Server as a self-hosted application on shared servers. So a service provider, who is a licensed mobility provider, would deploy your unified solution on its shared servers, where they would use SPLA to license Windows servers for that solution. And remember, you'd need to acquire Windows Server and Windows Server external connector licenses for self-hosting in your own data centre. And the last sentence here also reminds us that the licenses must also have license mobility through SA rights. Now, to find out more about this deployment option, there's a really useful volume licensing brief which is definitely worth reading to get a good overview of self-hosted applications, and you can see where to download it from on the screen here. Next up, we have the Azure Hybrid Use benefit, and as I said at the beginning, this is a relatively new benefit. It was introduced in February 2016. How does it help end customers get to the cloud? Well, in the last section we looked at it using existing application server licenses to license workloads in the cloud, and this is all about using existing Windows Server licenses. Let's see how it works. This benefit, as its name indeed suggests, is all about Azure, and indeed is restricted to Azure data centers only at this time. And so I've got my Microsoft data center on the left hand side again, with two end customers running virtual machines. And if you look at the profile, you'll see that this extends the previous scenario. The end customer wants a Microsoft owned and managed solution for the infrastructure, but this time they want to own and manage licenses for both the application servers and Windows Server. And with the Azure Hybrid Use benefit, an end customer can take a Windows Server image that they've created on premises and provision it to Azure. Now, what do they pay for this? Historically, if you wanted to run Windows Server in an Azure virtual machine, then you paid for a Windows Server Azure Virtual Machine consumption service. However, since February 2016, you've been able to assign your own Windows Server licenses with SA to an Azure virtual machine without Windows Server, and that, of course, maximises your existing investment. So can you see that I've made the little clouds that indicate the virtual machine is provided through Azure grey, as opposed to the white ones in the previous scenario? And this is to indicate that this is a different type of virtual machine in Azure. It's a non-Windows virtual machine. It's actually listed as a Linux one. And because it doesn't provide Windows Server, it's a cheaper option for the end customer than the Windows Server virtual machine shown in the previous example, since of course they're only being charged for the compute services. So you can see here that I've assigned a volume licensing licenses to the virtual machine to license the Windows Server part of the solution. And for the applications, we know that the end customers can use the license mobility through SA rights to assign volume licensing licenses to the applications running in the virtual machines. Now in my scenario, I haven't shown any particular role for a partner, but a cloud solution provider or CSP partner could resell the Azure virtual machines and generally assist with the deployment process on behalf of the end customer if required. But what I want to do now is to take a closer look at some of the details of how this benefit works. So we know that, in overview, the Azure Hybrid Use benefit allows an end customer to assign Windows Server licenses with SA to non-Windows virtual machines in Azure, and you can see that this applies to both standard and data center licenses. But here's a question for you. How many Azure virtual machines does each of these licenses cover? Well, there are some rules, of course, and the rules state that each license can cover up to 16 cores on up to 2 virtual machines. So that means that you could use a single Windows Server license to cover 2 8-core virtual machines, or a single 16-core virtual machine, for example. But what about a 32-core virtual machine? Well, there is an answer, of course, and you can stack licenses to cover virtual machines with more than 16 cores. So, are there any differences between a Windows Server Standard and a Windows Server Data Center license? Well, yes, there are. The standard licenses work in exactly the way you would probably expect. The licenses are assigned either to an on-premises virtual machine or to Azure virtual machine. And these rights are known as alternative. You have the choice of where you assign the licenses. And how do the data center rights differ? Well, the rights associated with the Windows Server Data Center license are known as additive, and this means that you can keep your licenses assigned to on-premises servers and use them to license Azure virtual machines. Be aware that although the data center license does give unlimited virtualization rights in an on-premises deployment, it must obey the 16-core rule across 2 virtual machines in Azure. And where can you find the rights governing use of this benefit? Again, they're in our new favourite document, the product terms document, and you can see the rules that we've just talked about detailed here. Again, if you want to find out more about this benefit, then this website actually is useful, and it gives some interesting price comparisons as well, so you can get an idea of potential savings that could be made using this benefit. And now on to our third scenario, which concerns RDS CALs. Solutions such as hosted desktops rely on licensing users for remote desktop services as part of the solution, and we'll see here how having existing RDS user CALs with SA means that an end customer has flexibility in where they run the desktops, and if a hybrid solution is their preferred option, how they have rights to both a cloud solution and an on-premises solution. So let's take that example of hosted desktops, and you can see I've started here with a service provider's data center with the infrastructure license through SPLA, and for each user accessing a hosted desktop, he needs to be licensed with RDS, and that can either be by the service provider using RDS SALs, as the green end customer is using, or, and this is the example we want to concentrate on here, by an end customer using their existing licenses. The yellow end customer has RDS user CALs with active SA, and he is able to use them to access the hosted desktops in the service provider's environment. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, these CALs may still be used to access on-premises solutions too. Now do note that the RDS CALs must be user CALs to allow this scenario. And again, the terms governing use of this right are in the product terms document, where you can see reference to the fact that these CALs must be user CALs and that solutions can be run on either the shared servers of a service provider, which is what we saw, or indeed within Azure. So let's take a look at that now. Now, this is actually delightfully simple. It's exactly the same as within the service provider's data center. An end customer can choose to use existing RDS user CALs with SA to access hosted desktops in Azure, or if he doesn't have these licenses, then a service provider can report RDS SALs through his SPLA agreement. Do you remember with the license mobility through SA benefit that an end customer needs to complete the license verification form to assign the relevant licenses to either Azure or a service provider's data center? Well, exactly the same process is used when RDS user CALs with SA are assigned to either of these environments as well. And as usual, here's some more information on this benefit if you're interested in finding out more. This article is a good overview of what you're allowed to do and has links to related articles of interest too. I should say at this point that although blogs are often a splendid resource, they shouldn't of course be treated as a substitute for the product terms document in any way. Our next section is around shared computer activation, so let's start by taking a moment to understand what this is all about. If you have users licensed for Office 365 Pro Plus, then the licensing model is a user subscription license. So that license is, of course, assigned to a user. Now imagine that you have deployed Office 365 Pro Plus in an RDS environment and that several users share a device to access the Office applications when they need to. Shared computer activation is a product activation mode that makes sure that a user is licensed correctly when they attempt to access the applications on that shared device. Every end customer who has Office 365 Pro Plus licenses, or indeed Project or Visio Pro for Office 365 licenses, may take advantage of shared computer activation, and recent changes to the rules allow end customers to take advantage of an increasing number of scenarios. Let's take a look. In this first example, the service provider is managing an Office 365 Pro Plus solution on his own hardware, and for the first time we're seeing two physical servers. Now this is because if the service provider wants to provide this managed Office 365 Pro Plus solution, then he must have hardware dedicated to each end customer. So you can see here that he has a yellow end customer and a green end customer, and both end customers have a dedicated server where the service provider is managing Office 365 Pro Plus for them. So what other licenses are involved here? Well, you can see the service provider has used SPLA to license the physical servers from an infrastructure perspective, and he'll also use SPLA to report RDS SALs for all of the users who need access to the managed server in the end customer. And the Office 365 Pro Plus licenses? Well, it doesn't actually matter how the end customer acquired these licenses. Here we're seeing them as being purchased through their existing volume licensing agreement, but they could also have been purchased through a CSP partner, for example. Note that enterprise plans, such as Office 365 E3 and E5, which contain Office 365 Pro Plus, are eligible licenses, but the smaller business plans, such as Office 365 Business, are not. So this is the first choice for an end customer. They can work with their existing service provider who can host this solution for them. But what other alternatives are there? In this scenario, we see another option for a service provider to manage an Office 365 Pro Plus solution, this time through Azure. You can see here that this service provider has two end customers, the usual green one and yellow one, and he's using Azure as the infrastructure for his Office 365 Pro Plus solution. We can see the Azure infrastructure is shown by the little clouds, and the Office 365 Pro Plus licenses are again already owned by the end customer through their volume licensing agreement. And as before, RDS is part of the solution, and you can see that I've put a couple of options on the diagram here. For the green end customer, the service provider has reported RDS SALs for the users in the end customer through the SPLA agreement, whereas the yellow end customer has RDS user CALs with active SA, and as we know, he's allowed to assign them for use in this scenario. But there's yet another option for us to consider, and this is an option that was made available in January 2016. We're back to a service provider's data centre, and in the first example we looked at, we saw that the servers had to be dedicated to the end customer. Here we're seeing that there is a situation when shared servers are allowed to be used. The licensing is the same as we've seen in the other scenarios. Here the infrastructure is licensed via the service provider's SPLA agreement, and the Office 365 Pro Plus licenses are required through the end customer's volume licensing agreement. And as we've seen, there's a choice as to how the RDS element is licensed, either as a SAL reported through SPLA or owned and assigned by the end customer through their volume licensing agreement. So what makes this scenario different? Well, it's all to do with the partner. This new scenario is enabled for authorised SCA partners, so it's worth at this point taking a look at what makes an authorised SCA partner. So how do you become one of these authorised partners? Well, first of all, you need to be a service provider, and to become one you sign the Services Provider License Agreement, as we know. Then you also need to be a cloud solutions provider partner, and to become one of these you need to sign the Microsoft Cloud Reseller Agreement, and also in fact meet some additional requirements, and actually I'll show you where you can find out more information on those at the end of this section. Now, an authorised SCA partner has to be both a service provider partner and a direct CSP partner. So let me show that here. And the final stage is to sign an amendment to the SPLA. This is the longest named amendment ever. It is the Services Provider License Agreement Office 365 Shared Computer Activation Qualified Cloud Provider Amendment. Or remember that as you sign the SCA amendment to the SPLA. And as a partner, once all these conditions have been met, there are just two other requirements. They need to pay an annual administrative fee, and they need to commit to monthly reporting as well. Now, there are full details on these requirements, as well as some useful resources such as an FAQ documents on a site, which I'll share with you on the more information slide in this section. Now, as usual, the rights that we've been talking about are documented somewhere, but this time not in the product terms. There's another document which has specific information regarding the licensing and use of the online services, which is, unsurprisingly perhaps, the online services terms document. And again, as usual, you can see a snippet of these rights with confirmation that the rights apply to Office 365 Pro Plus and Project and Visio Pro for Office 365, as I said. But do note the statement towards the bottom, which excludes Office 365 business licenses from these shared computer activation rights. The shared computer activation homepage that you see here is a splendid site. It's got a wealth of information, whether you're an end customer or a partner, and it's where you'll find lists of requirements. Those could be licensing, technical, system or reporting requirements, and there is also an excellent SCA FAQ document for partners as well, so well worth a visit to that site if this is of interest to you. And now to our next section, subscriber access licenses for SA. How does this provide a path to the cloud? Well, this is all about end customers who have CALs, client access licenses, with software assurance, who are currently accessing on-premises solutions and now want to move those workloads to a service provider's environment, but to make use of their existing investment in the CALs. Here we see a service provider's data centre, and the end customer on the right, the green one, has a solution where the applications are completely licensed through the service provider's SPLA agreement. However, the end customer on the left, the yellow one, has existing licenses for the application servers, perhaps Exchange and SharePoint CALs with SA, for example, and he wants to maximise his investment in these licenses as he moves to a hosted infrastructure. So he can use these licenses, and then the service provider just needs to pay for an incremental SAL for SA on his behalf to license Exchange and SharePoint as a software service on shared servers. And again, this represents an easy and very cost-effective way for this end customer to move to the cloud. So let's just get some detail on these SALs for SA. As we saw, these licenses are for end customers with software assurance who have active SA on their client access licenses and want to use the corresponding products in a SPLA hosted environment. They don't need to pay for a full SAL, they're eligible for these additional licenses, which is a very cost-effective solution. The use rights of these SALs for SA are identical to the corresponding SAL, and this is the list of licenses that are available. And you can see that the three main products are covered and that there are also options for end customers who have the Core CAL or Enterprise CAL suites. So where are the use rights for the SALs for SA documented? This time we turn to the Services Provider Use Rights document, and we can see from these snippets that there are separate sections for all of the different SALs for SA with their qualifying license requirements. And now to our final section, Visual Studio Standard Subscriptions. Now I'm using the new name for these subscriptions as I mentioned at the start of this session, since you're probably familiar with them by their previous name of MSDN subscriptions. Essentially, when you buy a license for Visual Studio, you have a Visual Studio Standard subscription, and that gives you access to Visual Studio software, which allows you to install Microsoft software for development and testing purposes. And in this section, we want to look at how a traditional developer who has been using his software benefit to deploy software in on-premises solutions can now start to develop in and for Azure without having to purchase additional licenses. So here you can see our usual diagram showing two end customers with virtual machines deployed in Azure and applications running there. If the end customers are using this environment for development and test, then what licenses do they need? Well, this actually is a very easy one. If their developers are licensed with an existing Visual Studio Standard subscription, then actually there are no other licenses that need to be required. But let's just remind ourselves about the rules for a Visual Studio Standard subscription. It's assigned to a named user, and the software used under the subscription may only be used for development and test. So looking at the diagram here, if one developer has deployed these solutions, then any of his colleagues who are also licensed with their own Visual Studio Standard subscription may use the applications for dev and test as well. And where are the use rights for using software in this way documented? Well, for this one, it's back to the product terms document. And you can see that we're in a bit of a transition phase with the naming here. So you do need to look at the MSDN subscription section as shown here. And you can see that the licensed user may run the software on Azure for development and testing purposes. And if you're interested in finding out more about these subscriptions and their benefits, then this is a good site to visit, and it's updated for the new name of Visual Studio Standard subscription, so in fact it is completely up to date. Well, that concludes our session on the different paths that end customers have to the cloud, and you can see here the different licensing scenarios that we've covered, with the theme in all cases being that if end customers have existing licenses, then there is an easy and cost-effective path to the cloud for them. I do hope you enjoyed this session, and good luck when you take the associated exam.